All
Let's
right,
go.
here we are, episode 7. Amazing. Not only is it amazing because it's episode 7, but we've got myself, we've got Rob, and special guest, Brian, who I only know as Brian at Cerberus.dev.
Yep, Brian Russo. Happy to be here. Rob asked me to join, I think like 20 minutes ago. He was like, "Can you join this podcast?" And I was like, "Sure, of course, anything for Rob," because his exuberance always bleeds over into everything he does. So
Yes,
I'm
yes.
excited to be here.
Fantastic. Well, glad to have you here. Um, I was always like to start, Rob, what's hot on your plate?
Dude, I have a lot that's hot on my plate. I was just joking with Brian earlier about some of the things. One of the biggest ones is like just going back to the whole DoD kind of technology ecosystem and really DoD like product ecosystem. I had this prompt. I was actually going to turn it into a post, but I kind of always have to pull myself back to not seem negative. But like, I definitely want to challenge the community. I want it to be like positive negative, where it's like this is kind of whack. How do we solve it together? But it's like, how do we bridge the gap between theory and execution? Like, there's so many circumstances where I find myself, and I think like Brian can relate to this, and you can relate to this, Mark. We all kind of like laugh about this sarcastically, and then we just like do the things we need to do. But like really, like from like a let's deliver things that produce value and provide a return on investment for like us, the American population. It's really important. But I like find myself discussing these like theoretical concepts with individuals that cite items on architecture diagrams. It always ends up creeping into the cloud ops discussion and like going from like, VX Rails and things deployed to like local on-prem data centers to the cloud. And it's all the typical like, typical DoD sales cycle where it's like, move in, gaslight the current situation, regardless of how valuable it is, and then make it seem like everything's really bad. And then just like kind of build out this foundation so you can execute for 3 years, miserably fail, they'll reset, you got your money, and they'll find somebody else to do the same thing. And it's just so expensive and exhausting. I think people just get worn out. Govies end up moving to different offices. And it's just this repeatable cycle. Like I joked with one of my partners today, and I was like, hey, like, if you had to gauge in like the DoD ecosystem, like I have a really unique situation that I talked about on previous episodes about the Space Force, where we did have some success with a small team of people, very niche, very specific kind of engineering outcome. But it's like compared to this situation where we've had some success, like how successful would you say like the rest of the DoD is when it comes to technical contracting outside of like, do you have SharePoint licenses? And it's literally like under 2%, under 1%. Like these programs just aren't converting. And that translates to our geopolitical influence and our ability to solve operational problems at scale and depend on operators to solve the technical problems that we need them to when shit hits the fan.
Cool. So Brian, you're in that world too, aren't you? As the self-described solution to the three-body problem. What what's your been what have your adventures been with the DoD and trying to make things better?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate to work on, a lot of R&D projects. I've spent most of my entire career really just kind of building systems from nothing. So very familiar with a lot of I talk about the extensibility trap a lot. And I think that kind of underpins a lot of what Rob is describing, this idea that, you need to deliver a solution for today, but then you also need to build something that can kind of socialize throughout the whole enterprise. And one thing, yeah, I always thought of kind of the DoD tech innovation center from the perspective, if you look at it from just a pure market aspect of, we have all these sort of barriers to entry, right? That's basically what everyone keeps coming back to. Like what Rob's talking about, I'm sure you're familiar with this as well, is this idea that DoD is somehow special. And to be clear, there are some unique, set of requirements. But when we talk about like IT and tech and analytics stuff, for the most part, it's the same thing, right? It's the same technologies. We're not building new databases from scratch. So I think what I personally find a little frustrating is, every year, and I joke with Rob about this, you go on LinkedIn and there's some new post about, well, we need to get more innovation, we need to upskill more people. So, kind of the question I look at it is, how do we sort of break out of this sort of endless cycle of, we're asking the same questions every year. Every year someone's like, oh, we just need to, solve with OTA. And to be honest, I'm kind of at the point where it's like, if we're going to be serious about it as a community, we need to just kind of shatter that mold and move to a new model.
Where do you see the biggest breakdown? Is it all on the DoD side, or is it a lot of the people who are supposed to be delivering some of these solutions that to Rob's point about there's teams that have it together and there's teams that don't. Like where who needs to change the most, do you think, or is it really just everyone?
Well, I look at it from the perspective of, if you look at it as a system that
Hmm.
has been designed, and design is perhaps too strong of a word, because I think it's more evolved. The system has evolved in a certain way. If you go back to, the whole concept of even having a prime, right? Even
Hmm.
having a concept of a clear defense contractor, taking a first principles approach, and it's like, well, why is that even a thing? And it's because there were at one point, certain sets of exquisite requirements. You think back, go all the way back to like the Skunk Works days when, you had Ben Rich and these folks actually like, stealing titanium from Russia basically and building these sort of exquisite systems. But now, kind of like we saw with the Starliner thing, there's a lot more trend towards commercialization, towards kind of, off the shelf solutions. And it's like two things can be true, right? You're always going to have, that those need for those sort of very bespoke types of, problems. And you're going to have, a need to sort of apply those technologies to the problem sets. But that's no different than the commercial world. If you go talk to like, an AWS commercial solution architect, they have the same problem, right? They go out to like a healthcare company and they say, hey, how do we fit our tech stack to your needs? And I think that's the key question, right? Is it's the sort of inversion of that conversation. With DoD, it's often more like um, we have to work with a defense contractor, and I think that's kind of the wrong approach.
So if you could change two things that would have the biggest impact, what would they be?
Oh gosh, I think having been fortunate to be both on the kind of the civilian side and the contractor side, I see kind of the pain points of both, and I think we need to kind of, as a community, I would say on the commercial side and on the government side, I think on the commercial side, there needs to be a better understanding of really fully embracing that kind of dual use culture. And bringing this idea that, hey, we're going to be a technology company first, or we're going to be an SI and we're going to kind of clearly understand what our role is and not try and do everything, because I think that's where a lot of those inefficiencies arise. And I think on the government side, and it was tricky before, it didn't work very well, but there needs to be some revisiting of the incentive structures, right? Because if when I was on the government side, one of the things that was very frustrating is you're not incentivized to deliver results, you're incentivized to avoid failure. And we in the civil service, I don't fully know the answer. I think there are probably people much smarter than me when it comes to organizational culture and hiring practice and things like that. But there needs to be a more open and transparent conversation about aligning the incentives of individuals with the that capability outcome for the mission, and less just about, oh, we're going to be safe, and we're going to pick DSIP's objectives that are just very safe. And the joke used to be, hey, I'm going to put something in there that's basically for the whole year that I've already accomplished in the first quarter, right? So then you're always exceeding it. It's just kind of this ridiculous game.
Okay. So it sounds like, I guess this is kind of good that it's not like anyone on either side being nefarious or incompetent. It's just rational people doing what they are incented to do, and just the incentives are not aligned. And so no matter
Absolutely.
the downside of that is no matter how well-meaning everybody in that system is, if the incentives aren't aligned, it's still each one will can win independently and the whole thing loses. Huh. Well, who sets that? Who does that? Who makes these incentives?
I don't think there is any sort of, this is always the joke, right? You think that, as I advance through my career, finally I'm going to get to that little room with a little cabal.
Hmm.
There's no cabal. The system evolved. If you think about it from a
Right.
cybernetics in system theory, it's a complex system. The joke is it's a complex system because it involves people.
Hmm.
And, people are chemical machines. We're driven by hormones and our interactions and things like that. Um, so yeah, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think that's a really good way of reframing what I said. It is an outcome. I introduced the concept structural determinism. Like, we have these structures and they heavily drive these outcomes. So I think for all of us, we have this collective responsibility to refine and develop our self-awareness. So we're actually, kind of looking at the process in a holistic, cross-cutting across all of it and say, hey, we understand, the contract structures are built, or some, the CPARs, et cetera. How do we all work as a community to collaborate on that and drive a better outcome? And I think that's one thing that's missing a lot is, it comes back to any relationship. There's an element of trust or distrust. And if you have distrust in the relationship and you're not approaching it from the perspective of how does, business and government work together towards that holistic outcome, businesses, they want stability and they want, to be able to hit their revenue targets, of course, and government wants an outcome. So it's really, I think, and again, this is where I start to sound like a LinkedIn post, right? But it's really about just figuring out how to do that partnership. And as Rob was saying, less about these sort of perverse incentives or unintended consequences.
Do you think like it's going to take one particularly motivated, government entity, and then a couple particularly motivated, small contractors like you and and Rob, um, to kind of show an example, to kind of bend each other a bit, to just show an example of what it could look like, and then maybe it grows from there. Um, would that
Yeah, I
be?
definitely think so, and I'd be curious to hear Rob's thought about this as well because I know he's spent a lot of it. But I think it's always going to be a combination, right? We
Mm-hmm.
all in our minds like to think that there's going to be this big watershed moment, and you know
Mm-hmm.
someone flips the big knife switch like an old old movie with Frankenstein or something, and then everything changes. That's not how the world typically changes.
Right.
It's a combination of these inflection points, and often in the past, I had been very critical of some of the larger organizations and their resistance to change. But the flip side of that is, you know, it's kind of like what we're seeing in sort of the self-driving car space now, right? You had Tesla as like an early market leader, but once the Toyotas or the BMWs, these big organizations that they may have not initially understood the value of that technology, but what they bring with them is this huge, apparatus that may not have known how to do specifically that type of R&D or engineering, but they know how to do it as a culture, right? So once they kind of like, start migrating and shifting in that direction, they're bringing that host of capability. So I think to your point, Mark, it's a combination of small people kind of doing that. If you think about it, this is kind of this surface that everyone's navigating together, and right, and some people are stuck in little local
Mm-hmm.
optimizations, and other people can see a little further. You have some of those early market leaders that are able to kind of get out there and figure out some of those things. But then the big ones, when they come behind them, um, they bring that benefit of their, large, engineering and administrative maturity. And then you start getting into things that do matter at scale. Once you get away from kind of a bespoke, small kind of project, these are the kind of things that I personally, I'm not that guy. But once you start getting into, scaling, it's like things like, quality assurance matter, quality control. You need to bring that up on the tail because if you're working with like, some high speed, sensitive activity or black project or something like that, I can joke you can have the the um the suite of guys in lab coats behind there flipping all the dials, but that's not a scalable solution when you deploy it at large, right? You're going to need to bring that maturity. So I think it's always going to be a combination of those sort of early movers and the larger organizations that bring all that wealth of knowledge and depth with them.
That makes sense. I still can't believe they call the role a capture manager. That just feels like it sums up the whole problem or a big part of the problem
Yeah.
right there. That always drove me crazy. That capturing, that just feels wrong. Rob, what do you think?
Can you hear me? I just like
Yeah.
switched the mic out. Cool. No, like really great thoughts. Totally agree with all of it. It's so funny just because like, classically Brian and I and you too, Mark, like I think all three of us have done like very aligned with just our perspectives, solving like different problems and like an enterprise kind of, breakdown. I've been very focused on design and growth. You've been focused on customer success. Brian focused on like architecture technology and also being able to empathize with things that people are willing to like use and buy. I think that's kind of what it takes. I think one of the biggest challenges right now, a lot of the times in the DoD they point at like talent, like IT talent or tech talent or whatever, and I think like they overcomplicate that kind of situation a little bit. Like it's not necessarily just IT or tech talent, but it's also people that have like a strong opinion about getting a lot out of a situation. They don't look at the situation the same way that hedge fund managers do, right? They're not trying to squeeze as much value out of an opportunity as possible. And they're just not incentivized to care enough about it, honestly. So it's kind of like this lethargic, their down select or their kind of incentivization to pick a partner is tied to like some weird kind of combination of like relationship stuff and social things that don't really matter, and like a feel good story, like good marketing that they can relay to someone else that like gives them influence, and then kind of like the technology, the feasibility, whatever the proposal's ability is to like solve a problem that they have. And that, I think that's one of the biggest issues in our ecosystem. I don't necessarily know how to solve it, but Brian, you mentioned like CPARs. There's just like whenever you have like a really convoluted kind of governance system, it's a lot easier to take a blue chip artifact that's within that ecosystem and make it more relevant than it is to introduce something new and expect people kind of like, change their behavior around that thing. So like
Remind me what CPARS was again, Rob.
it's a way to gauge like the past performance
Oh,
and the execution of somebody, right? But like
that's
what
right. That's
it
right.
ends
Okay.
up breaking down to, because of just how the ecosystem's evolved, is like, did you break the law or not? It's very like legal and not tied to like actual productivity capability.
That's
Um,
right. In theory, it's the reviewed performance of a vendor contractor to see if you want to use them again. But to your point, that's not
Yeah,
what's
and like
happening,
most
right?
things in our ecosystem, it's just evolved into this like, oh, we have to do this. Okay, well, I don't like you because like we didn't go and enjoy dinner together enough times, or like just like some weird
Right.
thing like isn't really tied to like, is the product or capability that you were on the hook to create solving a problem for the operators that are using it, that have issues like in the trenches,
Right. What do you think
And
is going to happen? Like, it seems like it's going to get a lot harder with, the use of AI for like, oh, let me analyze the request, the RFP, and have it just generate. Yeah, I do that, with all the right terms. Like, that's got to be, I think this is how AI works. If one side gets ahead, the other gets ahead of where originally, oh, for the hiring side of, oh,
Yeah.
sweet, we'll use AI to quickly filter out real people's writings and credentials and qualifications. But now when everything's written by that same AI, everybody looks the same and perfect. Um,
Right. It gets back to the alignment problem, right? So now we'll have two AIs talking to each other, and from that local optimization standpoint, like we'll do a really good job on it. But to get back to kind of the bigger conversation, it's like, well, why are we even doing this? That's, as Rob would say, that's not turning in any value for the customer. Things like
right.
CPARs, these are risk management frameworks that have been put in place, right, to manage quality. And again, those things are important. But the challenge then is if you're a very small business or a non-traditional one, this is like a new system, a new language you have to develop fluency to even
Mhm.
just interact with that ecosystem. And that ends up, you can essentially model that as a cost. So that gets back to, well, you know, how am I going to even start to interact with these requirements if I have to go through all of these processes just to be able to get to the front door? And for a lot of people, they're just going to not know how to do it because they lack that fluency.
Right. And then and then for that, whatever that software is to get an ATO, um,
Oh gosh, don't even get me started
a
on
FedRAMP.
ETOs. Like it's
Yeah,
just
it's harder.
yeah, we could talk for hours just
Yeah.
about my qualms with the whole cybersecurity industry and how I think it's become very inwardly focused on itself.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Well, on a somewhat different topic, I've been experimenting with something lately, um, called the Yes Machine. Uh, that has been interesting. I don't know how long it'll last, but I'm giving it a shot of where, um, basically just in general, I'm purposefully, whenever someone wants me to do something or in a certain way, just no pushback, no ego, no internal filtering of what's their motivation or what are they doing, and just saying, tell me more, and that sounds great.
Mhm.
Let's go do it. And it's having a really interesting effect of where, on the one hand, and because with zero pushback, I end up getting 15-minute lectures that are just insanely rude and ridiculous, but I'm finding myself able to like a little trout in the stream, just wait for the nuggets of good ideas to come through and just grab that and just be like, yep, we'll do that. But it's amazing when you let people just run and like just let them do their thing and don't question, don't push back, whatever. Like it's amazing what you get. I mean, like literally this recently, this one person, literally 20 minutes later, they're just still on this diatribe about how I haven't been doing, how I was thinking about something wrong, and this is the way to do it, and why didn't you do this, and this is it,
Mm.
because when you do this and this, and again, there were some really good ideas in there. And it's like when I just was like, fine, like, I don't care, let's let it ride. I'm kind of learning a lot through that, some folks. Now at some point, I don't know how long this will go, because at some point people are gonna expect you to have done all the things you agreed to. But in the meantime, just saying absolutely, that's great. I'll go do that. It just really opens people up. It's weird about, like, you realize like how much you have stopped people up. Now, a lot of it should be stopped up and not done and thought through more. But still, again, like the most amazing thing is it's partly again like how just far people will go when you let them. But then again, also like that there are some really good ideas that pop out. Like it's wrapped in this steaming turd sandwich, but if you just hold your nose and put on some gloves and get in there, like you can find some cool things. So that's
There's
I
a
don't know,
great
that's my current experiment.
there's a great blog post, and I'm sure you can Google it, but it's probably one of those sort of, um, apocryphal stories, right? I don't know if it's a
Hmm.
true story, but it's give it 5 minutes, and basically the setup is, this guy's giving a talk at a conference. He explains his whole sort of perspective and vision, and someone runs up to him afterwards and basically, hey, here's all the ways you're wrong, and the speaker's response is, hey man, give it 5 minutes. And this is
Hmm.
this is one of my favorites, because I used to be the person who would go up and tell someone how they were wrong. And the blog post captures it far better than, okay, but the essence of what it is something you touched on, Mark, which is this idea that a new idea is sort of vulnerable, right? And it's not perfect, right? And you need to kind of support it with this ecosystem to sort of feed it and nurture it and help it grow. And you know I used to work with teens, mentoring them, and what I quickly learned that has been very sort of useful in the dealing with executives as well is that you can't actually tell them anything. You have to sort of just set the conditions that they will look at it and go, okay, that makes sense. And for a long time, I thought only children were this way, but then I realized this is really just universal through all people. But yeah, I think that gets back to what you're saying is kind of the heart of back to what Rob was saying with the whole CPAR thing and the whole risk management conversation is fundamentally that's what at the end of the day, when you strip away all the contracting, all that stuff, is like the government, if we're talking defense tech, they're trying to do something, right? There's some mission
Hmm.
out there that's aligned with some sort of operational outcome, and then you're trying to introduce a commercial provider to provide some type of capability. So back to the first principles thing, we just need to focus the system as much on that and basically reduce the cost of all these things and recognize that all of these systems are there solely as risk management practices. They're not the actual goal themselves. And I think that, if that's one thing I would hope everyone would kind of develop some self-awareness about, is being able to understand, where you fit within that whole solution delivery standpoint. Am I the actual provider, or am I, you know, contributing an additional kind of organizational value around risk, legality, et cetera? Because both of those things are important.
I'm looking at you, Rob.
Agreed. No, I couldn't agree more, man. It's like a complicated system just because like it really boils down to that kind of like influence handoff marketplace experience where like Brian mentioned self-awareness, like it's so important and like it's hard to train people on because it's like condescending if you bring that term up. Like it's really hard to package and just be like, hey, like let's just be like really honest about our constraints, our being like the environment we have to deal with, kind of our charters or like what we're responsible for, which is a ridiculous thing to consider because in another complexity of our ecosystem is there's like a particular company type that is incentivized to like just do everything and anything. so they don't like specialize in anything. The incentive isn't to create a capability that they feel confident in being able to build, but it's like just to get an opportunity to fill a position with somebody that has a title that like maps to that thing that like this organization might need. And you just have like armies of people and crazy expenses and nothing being delivered or built. And and it goes back to the self-awareness. Like we have an inability to zoom out and just be like, hey, like, is this system really working the way we want it to work? Like, are we getting what we need out of it, or are we not? And if we aren't, like, how can we start to diagnose the things that are leading to these outcomes? Like, how can we avoid kind of going down these weird pathways and not getting good stuff? And how do we like, increase the likelihood of getting things that we need? Like, it's that simple, I feel like, but like nobody is like either willing to pause or have the cycles to pause. Like, it's very strange.
Who's the we though? Like, is it possible? Like, if one person
Yeah.
said, "Hey, I become self-aware," and oh
Yeah.
my gosh, what's going on? Like, what can they do? Because like again, like the we, I get like them and the mouse in their pocket, but like, what can that person do within an organization if they are, have become self-aware before the rest of the pods?
I think it's like a lot of these organizations are very top down. There's like a lot of these characters you see pop up on LinkedIn and at these conferences that for like 3 years have an opportunity to like really spout their perspectives.
Hmm.
And for 3 years, they have like a ton of influence, right? Before they get picked up by a defense contractor, move on, whatever. And it's like those are the people that can set this like super authentic culture that's never been set. People have gone like 30% towards that direction, 50% towards that direction, but they've never just committed and went all in and said, you know what? Regardless of what happens with my delivery, right? Like I can look at all the people that I've replaced and all the people that are like lateral to me. A lot of them have failed and continue to fail, and they're going to be successful. They have the influence. It's not about
Hmm.
building things that people need. They're going to maintain that influence because they have exposure to systems that can like, really control the outcome of acquisitions and stuff. And it's just like how our world works, right? So like there's nothing they're going to do that's going to make like the likelihood of them getting a job at CACI or Deloitte any different,
Hmm.
right? But they can just pause and say, you know what? Like maybe we need an opportunity to like not do this for like optics and do like the comfy thing where everybody feels good that somebody's like more relatable, but like be honest and just be like, how do we actually solve these problems? Can we just list out every single problem that exists right now, technologically, culturally, operations related, like how we kind of like source people and put them into positions of success, and like how do we gauge who's a good person for this type of outcome, and like just map everything out and just try to like, I know these are very complex systems, but like just have a goal, a pillar that you just want to be like as simple as possible. Like you just want to like take all the information, lay it all out, in addition to doing that, creating this like really transparent culture of like, don't be full of crap, like be really honest about how we interpret this information. Like our collective outcome, you're all going to be rich with influence, right? Whether we fail, succeed, get a 10x multiplier, like essentially as like a leader, I love you. Our goal is to like rewrite this script and do something that's like exciting and meaningful and something you'd be proud of a case study being written about. That's like the intention, right? And it's like, let's just like lay out all the chips on the board, all the different risk pieces and figure out how we can put them together, what additional pieces we need and why. Like be really honest about the why. Like, why do we need them? Like, do we know our environment well enough to like make this decision or have an opinion about this thing? And if you don't like create that culture where people are like, you know what, I don't really understand that thing. Like I was really, really quick. I'm kind of going in rabbit holes here. I'll end this right here. But like I was on a call recently where we were talking about like the whole containerization thing and the value proposition of Kubernetes and whatnot. And it was this call where like it was just the worst kind of social interaction you've ever seen, where like an engineer was talking to like a legacy IT manager who was like really good intention, wanted to just figure out if they could leverage this new technology. And the engineer didn't know better, and they just like jousted them and like made them feel silly about like not knowing about containerization and all this other stuff, instead of just like educating them and like meeting them where they're at and like empathizing with like the needs they had and the problem they were trying to solve. It's like you lost a huge opportunity there.
Hmm.
And it's like this weird, and then on the other end, on the IT kind of manager side, because of our like weird corrosive culture, they weren't like, hey, I just don't understand that well. Like I've been focused on all these other business related things. I've been managing just hardware in the last couple of years because that's been like my charter.
like, can you tell me more about how this is going to benefit like the mission that I'm supposed to be fielding these like, IT hardware for, or like these IT services for? Just like there's no authenticity. Everyone's just like trying to like, influence people's perception about a situation and their identity, and it's not about solving a problem. And it's like, how do we get people to focus on solving problems?
Is there any talk or appetite, or have you seen anything, kind of vaguely reminds me of, how do we, when there was the kind of the government goal of how do we get things more agile and digital transformation, and they kind of created, like 18F and like I think like the presidential
Mhm.
fellows and like those groups whose job was to kind of be an overlay to go in and teach agencies how to be more X. In that case, it was more agile, or how to move to different digital solutions. But have you heard any talk of like a group or organization? It can't just be a overlay policy, but just where like strike teams that go in and work with agencies to help them actually get results for the missions that they have.
Brian, I want to jump in because I'm so passionate about this one. I'm so passionate about it, and I'll be quick, but I want to hear Brian's thoughts. I'm not going to name the specific organizations on the DoD side, but they do exist. I don't really know what they're doing right now, but they do exist. On the civic tech side, 18F, our world, Mark, that like we
Mm-hmm.
kind of really interface with together, they did a phenomenal job, and they
Right.
continue to do a really good job. I think what's so funny is like if I had like any type of just like cheap feedback for the DoD. It's like, hey, look at your civic tech counterparts that have similar challenges. They're governed by like kind of all of this like higher level compliance related stuff. But like uniquely, they have massive platforms. They have huge problems to solve. They've dealt with like, controversial technology situations, the healthcare.gov thing that needed to kind of be rebuilt and stuff. And they just wore it like armor. They didn't try to sugarcoat the failure. It was like, hey, this sucks. Let's bring somebody else in to like fix this thing. Civic Tech and DHS are crushing it when it comes to their tech, and they're doing it at cost. It's so inspiring. Anytime I like cross paths with them, I'm always so excited. 18F, even when it comes to FOSS, like federal open source software, with the USWDS, the US Web Design System, like that's been adopted across the entire civic tech, government. I mean, whether it's CDC, HHS, NIH, like everyone's consuming the same design library, which is 100% accessible. They've automated all of these really like human-centered things, but also just like functionality and cybersecurity related things like simplifying components that you're going to use and stuff. Like, I mean, just incredible work. And so on the civic tech side, yes, 18F is still crushing it. There's other civic tech people that have taken on new roles, like I think 10X is one of the organizations. And then on the DoD side, there's entities. They're kind of doing their thing. They kind of get really confused about this whole, do we bring in operational SMEs or do we bring in technology kind of gurus from Silicon Valley? And then they both like kind of mesh together, and it gets really strange, and it never really seems to produce what like people expect or need. But what's unique about all of that last thing is like, then the DoD is like, all right, so our groups aren't like doing what maybe 18F might be doing. Let's bring in consultants. And that's where I feel like we dig the craziest trap, because like the consultant feedback, the way that our acquisition governance works is they're never incentivized to just kind of enable you to be able to do things on your own and have like a cutoff date, right? Where it's like, I'm going to get you to this level, you're going to be able to function on your own, and then we're going to leave. It might be high dollar amount, whatever. But it's like this whole, let's embed and become a new virus in your ecosystem where you're like dependent on us. And like, you can't really tell if we're telling you things that are like best practice or like, consulting quirks. So
Because they've captured
it
you.
opens
That
everything
was
up.
that was their mindset.
Oh, it's wild. And I'll stop now. But Civic Tech, I couldn't be more excited about the work that they're doing. VA is doing really cool stuff. Like I've just been always so impressed on the other
Mhm.
side. Yeah. Brian, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to circle back on one thing you had touched on, with that interaction between the engineer and really what you had is, people that just weren't communicating, right, at the end of the day. And I think this also kind of touches on something
Oh yeah, the engineer and the legacy IT person.
Exactly, right. So you both have two people that they're not really having a conversation, right? Because there's no information actually flowing back and forth, right? And I think part of that is to some extent, neither of them really understand why they're interacting, right? It gets back to what is the actual purpose we are all trying to move towards. Both of them are essentially trying to explain their position, but that's not quite the same thing as, moving the goalpost forward, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of gets back to something you had mentioned, Mark, about, I think you said something along the lines of, whatever happened to that whole thing of, upskilling the workforce on the government side. And this is something I had observed a lot, is you had, as I would say, patriotic Americans, people on the civil service side that are trying to advance their program, trying to advance the outcome, but they are wholly unprepared to just navigate, the technical landscape. I once worked on this one program where the contractor lead was a retired '06, and the government lead was, again, young, patriotic '04. Ran circles around him, right? He was wholly unequipped to deal with him because, the senior '06, he knew all the tricks. He was very good for the business, but it wasn't necessarily creating that correct outcome in terms of the overall mission. Um, and I'd offer two things. I think, one, there are a lot of good outcomes from a lot of those organizations, like 18F, and we could list others that are basically that kind of tiger team approach. I think where a lot of them struggle is there's not as much thought put into really kind of integrating them into the actual organizations they're helping. I'm not really convinced, having seen this a couple times, that this sort of bolt-on approach really works well. Because I think there's a lot of people kind of look at this from the perspective of there's some skepticism that they will persist, right? So a lot of times it's like, oh, okay, you're going to come in for 12 months, you'll try and help us, but then you're going to leave and we're going to be kind of, back where we were. The other thing I'd offer is there's a lot of kind of contract capabilities that exist that aren't necessarily leveraged as much as they could be. I mean, CETAs is one of these, right? I mean, CETA contracts are a great way to bring in that expertise that may be very difficult to acquire on the government side, due to, cost or whatever. Um, and, present that in the interest of the government, because of how that CETA structure. It's very similar to how I think, the warrant officer system on the enlisted side is very underutilized, right? I always thought that was a great system. I always kind of confused why it wasn't leveraged more, this ability to retain, better paid technical SMEs and keep them in sort of a domain area, as opposed to bringing them into kind of the general officer, which is, if you're familiar with that, is a very different track. So yeah, I think there's just, it really comes back to a lot of it's just inertia, right? You're talking about like, well, these legacy systems. Well, it gets back to, you have all those barriers to entry, and you have sort of this tucked premise, which is really a propaganda technique if you think about it. This tucked premise that you can't change this, right? If you start with that assertion, kind of like you were saying, Mark, about trying to default to yes is trying to default to no. A lot of people kind of do this to themselves, right? They say, well, you create this sort of set of barriers that, well, we can't. We can't change the legacy system. We can't change the legacy vendor. Well, if you approach the conversation that way, then you've already defeated yourself before you really sit down and you go, okay, well, yeah, the data is in there. I get that, but okay, is it a SQL database? Is it a Cumulo? How hard is it really to get that data out? Is it really as hard as we thought? Probably not. But I think it gets back to being self-aware and saying, like, again, I'm not going to name systems, but I've seen certain requirement systems, for example, that went through, hey, this V2 was supposed to be deployed real soon. And, Rob and I would, or other folks would kind of look at that and go, hey, that's just a CRUD app. We could have a front end team build a replacement in probably a couple of months for a very modest amount of money. But it's approached as this like $20 million program. And I think it gets back to the incentive thing. People are incentivized. What looks better on your DCEPs, right? And same on the CPAR side. Well, managed team of 100, $450 million program. And then someone else comes in and goes, yeah, that should be like a $5 million program with a team of 5, and then maybe, a couple for sustainment or something like that. But that's not how the system is incentivized on both sides.
Totally. Yeah. Well, before we wrap this up, like along those lines, another thing I'm kind of playing with and experimenting, we'll see how this goes, is I was given some really good advice lately, and kind of what you were sort of saying there, Brian, of there's always different ways to do something, or to respond to someone, or to solve a problem. And the what someone shared with me that has actually I've seen pretty quick results, but I like it a lot. It's when you're looking at, right, what are you have a problem and you need to make a decision. And typically what I know, certainly I do, I'm like, could do that. No, that won't work because of this, or like, oh, it'd be this. Oh, but that'll be hard. And, you kind of then kind of find the least worst thing and just go to it. And what was recommended was instead just relieve yourself of judgment or really thinking through things and just make a list of all the options you can think of. Good, bad, crazy, possible, easy, impossible, does not matter. Just write down all the options first. And now that you've got them all out, then you can go pick at each one. But you have 10 to work with, rather than if you were sort of picking them in your head out as you go, you're burnt out by number 3 and you don't even get to the others. And number 8 may be the golden ticket, but you wouldn't get to it unless it was there. So,
absolutely. I think I model that mentally as, hard constraints versus soft constraints. And I think, really the simple way of saying this is we invent hard constraints that probably don't really exist. And it gets back to, kind of what Rob was saying with that, legacy, DevSecOps engineer interaction is people don't know what they don't know, right? The customer, the person with the mission mindset, they understand what they're trying to do. They probably almost certainly don't understand the right way to do it. And that gets back to, a lot of these ideas that are well-intentioned, they have these unintended poor consequences. So people will say things like, well, what we really need, is the pilot to talk directly to the aerospace engineer. And it's like, well, I actually think that's a terrible idea, right? And that some people would say that's controversial. And you ask me why. And I'm like, well, because the pilot knows the current system very well. Right. And the engineer is going to be able to help them optimize that very well. Right. So it gets back to the first principle things. What are you really trying to do? And again, having that self-awareness of how we got here, why that legacy is important. And this is the key thing from user adoption that a lot of engineers do get wrong is they'll look at it and they'll say, well, that doesn't matter anymore because this new technology is going to transform it. And I think that's also false because, I used to work with this one legacy system that was just a massive pile of tech debt. And if you really broke down at a, reductionist level of what it was, well, it was, like so many problems, it was a database with, information flowing in and out and a bunch of interfaces, right? And so you think, oh, well, we could just, reinvent this in React or whatever. But again, it gets back to the real tricky part about doing that is recognizing that as someone told me, there are decades of requirements built into the system. So it's not so simple as just doing a schema transformation and building a new UI. You need to both go through that process of understanding why things are a certain way, and then crucially revisiting in light of this new future we all want to work towards. Which of those are you going to carry forward with you? Because some of them may be based on assumptions that are no longer relevant, but others may still have crucial edge cases. And I think it's developing that awareness to accept that both of those things can be true. That's what gets back to something we haven't really talked a lot about here, because again, it's its own conversation, but that trust and adoption. Because, when you're deploying a new capability, you always want to retain this self-awareness that, I would say nobody wants a server, nobody wants software, nobody wants an algorithm. They just want to do something, right? If you think about it, if it's a simulation platform, well, they don't actually want a sim. They want a simulation outcome. And more specifically, they want the decision advantage that comes from being able to do that effectively. So it gets back to, just having that self-awareness where you are in the process so that, everyone can trust and communicate and work together.
Awesome. Then I have 2 last questions. 1, Rob, can Brian come back? Can we do this again?
Yes, of course.
Excellent. 2, Brian, where do people find you? Cerberus.dev? LinkedIn?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn or Cerberus.dev.
Well, thanks, guys. This has been another fantastic episode, and we will talk again soon.
This has been so fun. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks for the invite. You guys take care.